Welcome back to the podcast. This is your host, Teresa Davis, and I have with me today a special guest, and his name is Greg Buffkin. And Greg is a grieving dad. He lost his son Ryan to suicide in 2015. He is the host of Hope After Child Loss, the Empty Chair Endeavor podcast. And he's here today to give us a father's perspective on grief and tips to manage hard days like Father's Day. Are you lost in the chaos of grief, struggling to find your way in the darkness? Are you asking yourself, will I ever be able to enjoy life again? Are you wondering where God is right now? Welcome to the Grief Mentor Show. This podcast is a safe place for you. It will shine a light into the shadows, helping you discover that joy and pain can coexist, that you still have purpose, and there is a path to peace. Hello, friend. I'm Teresa Davis. I too was lost in the chaos of grief the day my son died. Just like you, I longed for peace in this unfamiliar world. I longed for the weight crushing my chest to be lifted so I could breathe. I clung tightly to the anchor, and it was there that I discovered the tools I needed to navigate life after loss. And I'm ready to help you do the same. If you're ready, I'm holding my hand out to you, friend. Let me show you the way, one step at a time. Hello, Greg. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Hey, Teresa. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on your podcast. And people should know that Teresa was just the guest on my podcast.
That's right. We kind of did a podcast swap today, didn't we, Greg?
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Yes, we did. Yeah. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, tell the folks a little bit about Greg.
Oh, gosh. I really don't want to bore your listeners with too much about me. Well, let's see. I am married to my very best friend, Kathy, and we have been married for 47 plus years, about 47 and a half years now. And we have two children, one that Teresa has already mentioned, Ryan, who lives in heaven and is waiting for that reunion one day. And we have a daughter. She is our oldest, Whitney, and she and her son Eli live here in Florence, not too far from us, actually. Kathy and I grew up in this area of South Carolina. We're about an hour west of Myrtle Beach. It's not one of those exciting locations in South Carolina. We're on the intersection of I-95 and I-20. So people that come to Florence generally come to Florence on the way to Myrtle Beach or to Florida or somewhere up north. Just one of those crossroads. And we also have another grandchild, a granddaughter, who is actually Ryan's little girl. Her name is Olivia. She is now, she is 9.5 years old. She lives in Charleston, which is about 2.5 hours from us, with her mom. And her mom, Catherine, has since remarried, and they have two twin baby girls. And we are very blessed, like you guys, to have just an incredibly good relationship with her family. And I have to say this because Olivia is the spitting image of her daddy. I mean, she looks just like him. She is wired just like him. It is just uncanny sometimes. So when we see her, we see Ryan. And all of our friends who have watched her grow up, primarily through photos, will say the same thing. Every time we show them a new photo, it's, their response is like, oh my gosh, cannot believe this is like the female version of Ryan.
Well, that's a blessing for sure that you guys get to be able to see her grow up and watch her grow, for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, Greg, we are just a few days away from Father's Day. And because my podcast is mainly my voice, I wanted to bring your voice on today because I want to be able to provide a perspective for my listeners, the uniqueness of a father's grief, because as parents, we don't grieve the same. Mom's grief is different than dad's grief. And even though we grieve alongside of each other, there's characteristics of each grief that are different. And so I'd like for you to share with us, in your opinion, what makes a father's grief unique?
Yeah, that's a good question, Teresa. And I guess that the best thing that for me to frame this is I'm speaking from my my personal experience and perspective. And of course, it's been influenced as well by the guests that I've had on my podcast. I've talked to many grieving dads along the way, and every parent, moms and dads alike, our grief journeys are different, and the way that we process grief, like you said, is very different. But I think as men, one of our roles as we see ourselves is that as a protector and defender of our children and our wives. And when we lose a child, it that it's a direct hit on our ability to protect and defend that child that we lost. I don't know that it speaks also to the fact that that we dads like to be in control of things. And when something like this happens, you suddenly feel like your life is just spiraling out of control. And you feel guilty because all of these questions just kind of go flying through your mind of, if I had only been there, or what if I had only. And you can continue to ask those questions, and unfortunately, you can never have a real accurate answer to any of those questions. But it goes to that part of us that that we had that innate desire to to be that protector. And like I said, when we lose a child, we feel like part of our identity has just taken a hit. And it made me feel like, when I lost Ryan, that I let him down, that I just wasn't there when he needed me in that moment. I didn't have the ability to be. So it's not realistic, but it's what goes through your mind, as a dad. And I think also grief has a way of just stripping away those veneers of toughness, and, as I said, being in control, as a male. And it brings us face to face with some of our deepest fears. I know one of the deepest fears that I think that any parent has is the fear of losing your child. And interestingly enough, probably a year after we lost Ryan, I remember having a conversation with my wife Kathy one day, and I told her that, I said, probably from the time Ryan was 16 or 17, somewhere in that age range, I just had this, um, an unexplainable feeling that we were going to lose him. I didn't know what to attribute that to. And every time I would have that feeling, I would just try to push it out of my mind as quickly as I could, because it's an awful thing to even consider. And what was interesting is that Kathy said, so did I.
Mm.
And yet we had never expressed that to one another. So that's why I say that, guys like to think of themselves as being tough. And with our children, we know we need to be tender. But when something like that happens, it it does bring us face to face with something that we just never ever thought that we would have to face. And it's a scary thing.
Let me ask you something, Greg. So you acknowledge to us what I hear you say, the feelings of powerlessness as a protector, that your what you feel your God-given role is. How did you process that that feeling that you had of how did you process that powerless feeling?
Mm, well, Teresa, I think that probably was encapsulated, that part of my grief and grief journey was encapsulated in the things that I already had in place in my life, the habits and just the things that I chose to do every day. And what I'm getting at primarily is that, I'm a follower of Jesus. And as such, it had been my practice for 20 some odd years at that point, that every morning when I got up, one of the first things that I would do is to spend some time alone with the Lord, reading his word and spending time in prayer. And so the morning after we had to travel back, we were out of town when we got the news that Ryan had died. And the next morning when I got up, you know, I I did what I do every morning. Got up and went and sat in the chair that I always sit in. And as hard as that was, I didn't know anybody else that I could really turn to with what I was dealing with except God. And I had to, I couldn't do anything other than what I had been doing. Anything else would have felt completely abnormal. And it was just it gave me such a sense of security and such a sense of peace to be able to go and just sit down with him and express some of those things I was feeling. I think initially Teresa, I know that this probably is true for you guys as well. We feel those things, but we don't know how to process it initially. It's a
Mhm.
lot easier to look back retrospectively and think about how did I process feeling that way. I wasn't doing it consciously.
Mhm.
I was just doing what I already had in place in my life that I knew worked. And that was my relationship with the Lord.
What a great point, Greg. Having those habits already in place and not allowing your feelings to overcome you to the point to where you couldn't sit in the presence of the Lord. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important that, I think sometimes in our culture, we put far too much emphasis on feelings and emotions. And very often we allow those to rule us. I mean, how often do you hear people say, well, just follow your heart?
Mhm.
Well, interestingly enough, in the Bible, it says the heart is deceitful above all things.
Mhm.
And so sometimes, especially in, when your life has been intersected by something like the loss of your child, it's so traumatic that you have to make conscious choices and decisions in what you're doing. Because if you just give into those emotions, you could just curl up in a ball and and just stay there. You
Mhm.
could stay in bed. And I'm not saying that it's wrong for somebody who finds themselves staying in bed. You just can't stay there on and on.
Mhm.
So I think it is important to realize that you can get past you don't have to let your emotions rule. Yes, you need to experience them because they
Mhm.
are real. God gave us emotions, and we do need to walk towards that grief, towards that pain, because I mean, you've got two choices. You can walk towards it, or you can walk in the opposite direction, but you can't stay neutral.
Mm,
You're doing one or the other.
that's so well said. Looking back on your grief journey, Greg, because we're at what are you at about the 9-year mark now?
October will be 9 years. Yeah.
October will be 9 years. Looking back on that, is there anything you would have done differently with your wisdom now? Do you see anything that you would have done differently in your grief journey?
I probably spent more time thinking about this question than I did any of the others that you told me you might ask me. I prayed about that one more than any of the others as well. I also asked my wife what, what she thought about that question. And she had a really insightful answer. And as I thought about that, I realized that, that probably is the only thing that I would change as well. And that is, and I think this happens so often when there are other siblings that are left behind, the surviving siblings,
Mm,
who are also, by the way, known as the forgotten mourners,
absolutely. Yes, that's correct.
because, the parents are the ones who get all of the attention when things like this happen. So Whitney was married at the time. She had a little boy at the time who Eli was, I guess, 5. And so, we were in such pain and so overcome by the trauma of losing Ryan, and not just losing him, but losing him to suicide. And and by the way, it took me 5 years before I could say that word,
Mm.
suicide. I would always say Ryan took his own life. That's just one of those aspects of grief that, I can't explain. I just couldn't bring myself to say it. But Whitney Whitney was impacted by her little brother's death far more deeply than Kathy and I could have possibly known at the time. I wish that we had known how much pain she was in. I think that we would have tried to have figured out a way to have included her in that grief process with us if we could have. But I think one of the reasons that often doesn't happen is because those grieving siblings, especially if they're adults, don't want to put any added
Mm.
pressure or any added stress on their parents. So a lot of times they either keep it to themselves, or they talk with somebody else that may or may not have the wisdom to help them through it. But that is one thing that I think if we were able to change it, that we would um, that we would be a little bit more attentive to, or I shouldn't say attentive to. We were when we were aware, but that maybe we would have thought to ask more often how she was doing and how she was processing it.
I think your perspective is so spot on, and I totally agree with the concept of them being the forgotten mourners. And it's interesting to me, Greg, because I sat down with my husband and I said, "You are grieving dad. What should I ask Greg?" And
Mm,
that question came from him.
did it really?
That question came from him because I think you can speak to this, but just from witnessing grief in my husband, I feel like that they are, as men, you're always evaluating what you can do better because you are leading your family. And
Right.
so, thank you for sharing that perspective because so many of us who have lost adult children that have siblings, that's an area that many still struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, when Kathy and I started the empty chair endeavor, that's one of the things that was part of our vision, was to not just change the narrative about of what it is that grieving parents go through, but to also change the narrative about what those surviving siblings go through, because a lot of times their grief is just passed off as though it were, like somebody had just lost their family pet,
Mm.
or more of a minor type of grief. But that's not the case.
Especially when it's their only sibling. And you said Whitney,
Yeah,
Ryan, yeah, and that's kind of similar with our situation. And so when they become, they're not an only child, because our children, Ryan is always going to be your child, Andrew's always going to be my child. But it is the one that is left here with us to walk this earth with us. And so that's an area I think, as far as the grieving the death of your child, we need a little more exploration in on how to be more supportive with our children, our living children. I think that's a
yeah,
good point. Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
What would you say, Greg, has been, looking back through your grief journey, what has been the most helpful for you as a dad? Since we're talking about grief from a dad's perspective, what's been the most helpful for you in your grief journey?
There are probably several things that I could mention, Teresa, and I think probably this is going back to something I talked about a moment ago, is the fact that I already had in place in my life a relationship with Jesus going into this. I cannot imagine getting that phone call that we received that morning, that we had lost our son, and not having a relationship with the Lord as our foundation, as my foundation. So I'd say that's the most primary and most important thing that helped me. Secondarily, was being able to share and navigate through a lot of that with Kathy, my wife. I was very, very fortunate that the company that I worked for, and I think you'll appreciate this. I had an immediate manager who was a female, and her manager was a female. And so and interestingly enough, the regional manager was a registered nurse like you. And so these were two very sympathetic, um, kind hearted, compassionate ladies who encouraged me to take all the time that I needed away from work. So I was able to get short term disability that was paid for by the company, it was already in place. So I was able to take 2 months off from my job.
Mm,
And I, we just thought that it was really important for the two of us to spend those first few days and weeks together. Because if I had gone back to work, Kathy would have been home by herself.
mm,
And I was in no place to go back and face customers every day. I was a pharmaceutical rep. And so I had to be, quote, unquote, on all the time, always in front of physicians and nurses and doctors, office staff. And I couldn't have imagined doing that in those early days and weeks. So Kathy and I were able to just spend time together. It didn't mean that we talked all the time about it. I mean, we had there were all those legal things that we had to walk through, lots of decisions and choices that had to be made to help our daughter-in-law with things that she was facing, that no 25-year-old
mm.
young woman should have to face on her own. So we were trying to help her as well. And so that time was just invaluable to us. We also had in place in our lives relationships with other people. We were a small part of a small life group. And if you're listening and you don't know what a life group is, it's like a Bible study group where we meet at someone's house, and we might study scripture, or we might study a book, and we just share life. We typically, food's involved. I mean, in the South, when is food not involved? That
Right.
always helps. It's one of those comfort aspects of our grief journey. But we had those people in place in our life. And I would tell you that if you don't have people like that in your life, people that you regularly engage in just the normal stuff of life with, the people that may come over and hang out at your house, people that you meet for dinner somewhere, it's really important. And I would even say it's critical when something like this happens. And if it hasn't happened to you, if you live long enough, it will. You might not lose your child. You might not even lose it might not even be your mate, but something is going to intersect your life and you're going to get T-boned by something at some point. And it's so important to have people like that. The ones that you can call at 2 o'clock in the morning if you need to. The
Mm-hmm.
people that will just stop what they're doing and come over. And if your grass needs to be mowed, they won't even ask. They'll just do it. And if they see dirty dishes, they'll take care of that without having to bother you with asking about it. I would say also, and this is, not everybody chooses to do this, but from our own personal perspective and experience, Teresa, if you have access to a grief counselor, please take advantage of that. If you can afford it, um, please take advantage of that. They can be such an invaluable resource to help you process,
Mm-hmm.
because most of us don't come with a built-in understanding of how to process this or how to navigate through something that, as I've heard you say, is so traumatic. I can't think of anything more traumatic to a mom or a dad than losing a child.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I would say those are the, probably not all inclusive, but those are the things that really stood out to me.
Well, and you've kind of spoke, so I want you to speak to that dad. I want you to speak to the grieving dad because, and some of what you just said was great advice, but I want you to think back to the very beginning of your journey, especially that first year, because we're coming up on Father's Day, and the overwhelm of the first can just sometimes make you paralyzed, and because you just don't know how to manage it. So I'd like for you to speak to the grieving dad who maybe this is their first, it's a day on the calendar. I
Yeah.
like to, you kind of point that out to the grieving moms that I work with. It's a day on the calendar, but it does hold significance that we have, as a culture here, especially in the United States, that we place emphasis on. And it can be very difficult to manage in those first years. So speak to that grieving dad. Tell us how you managed your first Father's Day, and what would you say to him right now?
Well, that is a good question because, as you said, we're just a few days away, and I can remember, um, oh man, I dreaded knowing that Father's Day was approaching. We had to go through Mother's Day first, and I remember how tender that was for Kathy. And I knew that Father's Day was just around the corner, and I didn't even want to think about it. But you can't escape it. I honestly don't remember what we did or what I did that first Father's Day, Teresa. I don't think we did anything significant. We, as we did with most other holidays and events that we had celebrated together as a family when Whitney and Ryan were growing up, we tried to stick with those traditions simply because we knew that it would be what Ryan would want, and it was also a way to honor him. But it also was just, it was a comfort to us to do things that we knew. I mean, these are the things that are already in place in your life, and they're the knowns, because at this point in your life, when you're dealing with all the grief and the pain and the suffering of all of that, it seems like everything's just an unknown. and
Mm,
everything you face is another unknown, uncharted water. I would say that I do remember that, of course, it just made me very sad. And honestly, even with other people around, I felt very lonely because I had lost my only son.
mm,
And, it just, Ryan was always so faithful to, to text me first thing
mm,
on Father's Day morning. They lived 2.5 hours away, and he never forgot to do that. And so, I missed getting that text. And, it's just knowing that I wouldn't be able to see him. I was also really sad that it was, it was Father's Day. It should have been Father's Day for Ryan.
mm,
And, he experienced one Father's Day, but Olivia was only, oh gosh, about 5 months old. No, I'm sorry. She was only about, yeah, maybe 6 or 7 months old at the time. And so she wasn't old enough to really celebrate with him.
mhm,
But I just, it was just heavy because, for the first time, we would really be able to celebrate Father's Day together as two dads.
oh, yeah.
So that was hard. I think for dads that are listening, if you, as hard as it is to carry on with family traditions, if there were things that you guys did together as families, I think one of the ways that you can honor your child is just to carry on with those traditions. Yeah, I mean, it can be gut wrenching to do it, and pretty dang painful. But again, it's one of those things where you just have to choose to walk towards it and to move through it. And the first one is always the hardest.
Mm.
It's like with all of that entire year of firsts.
Yes, definitely. And I like your perspective of what you said about the knowns, because there's so much about our children. After our children die, we face so many unknowns because we don't know how we're going to survive it. So I really liked how you phrased that it brought you comfort because it was the knowns and you could stick with that. So thank you. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah.
And in closing, so I'd like for you to share with us. So we talked about your podcast a little bit. Tell us more about that, but tell us about the Empty Chair Endeavor. Tell the folks what that is and how they can get access and how they can help you with that.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. As I think I alluded to this earlier in our conversation, after Ryan died, Kathy and I knew that we wanted to help other grieving parents, but it took a while for us to really navigate through the pain and the confusion of where we were to be able to get to a healthier point, our place in our life, that we could actually think about that at a practical level. And so I retired in early 2020, 3 weeks before COVID hit, actually. So I retired in time to go into isolation. So that summer I had a lot of time on my hands, and I just sensed the Lord leading me to capture a lot of our journey in writing. I was not I really was not one for journaling. Kathy had always been pretty faithful to do that in some way, shape, or form, but I never could get into that. So that summer after I retired, I probably spent the better part of 2 months off and on just capturing what our journey had been like, what we had experienced, what it felt like, and what we wanted to say to other grieving parents who were in a fresher season of that grief. And so I didn't know what to do with it after that. I had all of this in writing, but really didn't know what form it was to take. And God had just not provided any clarity about that at this point. Fast forward about 6 months, two other couples that Kathy and I were attended the same church with. We had one couple we had been friends with for years. Ryan grew up with their children, and they lost their 28-year-old daughter that December, totally unexpectedly. And 2 months later, the other couple lost their son, who was also Ryan's age, 26, to a glioblastoma. So he had fought a long, hard battle, a lot longer than the doctors had given him. But that brought us together. And so over the course of the next several months, we started talking about what we wanted to do. And later that fall, we started meeting together as couples, and we came up with the idea of the empty chair endeavor, because that empty chair represented both the empty chair that's left in someone's home, and also that empty chair that sometimes is represented by a grieving parent who, let's say, they are sometimes people that are looking in don't know how to approach us. And so a lot of times, if they, just using the analogy, see us sitting somewhere on a bench or sitting in a pew at church or something, a lot of them just kind of skirt around us because they don't want to have to deal with it. I mean, who would really want to? Nobody wants to think about losing their child. And sometimes I think other people, it almost feels contagious. If we actually engage in a conversation, we don't want to entertain that thought. So that's kind of where the idea of the name came from. We created a website, and in that website, we have encapsulated some of our journey that I captured in writing that summer. We talk a good bit about things that people who are looking in from the outside, things that can help them in walking with someone who's lost a child, things that that maybe aren't so advisable, and other things, as we both know, that actually can be helpful. Just sometimes offering the gift of your presence, being a good listener, not trying to fix us. We expand on that and talk about that a good bit more on the website. The website also contains some resources that we recommend for grieving parents, in the form of books and other websites, other podcasts that are available.
What's the name of that website, Greg?
The name of the website is www.emptychairendeavor.com.
Okay. Say it again, www.emptychairendeavor.com.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll make sure that I put that in the show notes so folks can access that.
Yeah, great. And out of that came the podcast, Hope After Child Loss podcast. And that was something that came about a year and a half later. We were invited to be the guests on a podcast, Davey Blackburn's podcast, Nothing is Wasted Ministries.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struggling at the time because I felt like we were just kind of spinning our wheels trying to get opportunities to go and speak and meet with civic groups and churches. And it was like the light bulb came on when, after Kathy and I did that podcast. It was like the Lord was showing me that you can reach people with your message that you would never be able to reach locally, up close and personal. People that we would never in a million years be able to engage with otherwise. But because of the technology, a podcast can get that message to people, not just in other parts of our world, but in other parts of the world, literally.
Literally. Yeah. Other countries, people that don't have near the resources that we have here in the US.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Greg. And I'll include, and the name of the podcast is Hope After Child Loss, the Empty Chair Endeavor, if you want to listen to that. And then I will put the website resources in the show notes as well. Greg, thank you so much for coming and sharing and being vulnerable and sharing your grief with us. I thank you for that. Anything else you want to say before we close out?
No, no, other than just thank you so much for the invitation to be your guest. It was a real honor. And I want to say thank you for what you're doing, Teresa. I think the work that you're doing on your podcast and the work that you're doing actually mentoring grieving moms is such important work. And I know that your devotional is going to continue to touch a lot of people's lives. So
Well,
thank you for your ministry.
well, thank you, Greg. All I can say is to God be the glory, because I can't do anything within my own strength, and even grieve the death of my child. That is not within my own strength. And so if I can help someone walk along that road, then I'm just thankful for that opportunity. So that is all I have for you today, guys. So until next time, take care. Did today's episode touch your heart? If it did, would you take a moment and leave a review on Apple Podcast? I read every single one. Scroll all the way down past all of the episodes till you come to a place where you can leave 5 stars. And would you go a step further and write a written review? It would mean the world to me if you did. Would you mind to share today's episode with somebody that you know that needs a ray of light in their grief journey? I would so appreciate it if you did. From my heart to yours.